I stood in the rain, completely still, tears mingling with the falling drops when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was a small, delicate, yet firm hand. I turned and saw a child, about 7 years old, with eyes as deep as ancient wells, offering me a slightly damp paper napkin. She didn't say a word, she just smiled, in that way only children can, without fear, without judgment, without questions. And in that instant, something inside me broke, or maybe it mended, because it was in that moment that I understood my whole life had been built on a lie. I had created myself. My name is Rafael Santos. I'm 42, an architect, always a practical person, focused on tangible results. I grew up in a family where words were a rare commodity. My father was a man of few words. In fact, he barely spoke. He worked in a factory, came home tired, ate dinner in silence, and watched television until he fell asleep in his armchair. My mother tried to fill that void with conversations about her day, about the neighbors, about anything, but silence always won. And I, as a boy, learned that words were unnecessary, that feelings were inconvenient, that it was best to remain silent and move on. This pattern followed me throughout my life. In school, I was the quiet but diligent student. In college, the dedicated student who only spoke when necessary. At work, the efficient professional who solved problems without drama. And in relationships, well, in relationships, I was a ghost, physically present, but absent in everything that truly mattered. That's how I lost Marina. Marina was, it's hard to describe Marina without my voice cracking. She was light where I only saw shadows. She was a chatterbox, laughed loudly, gesticulated when telling stories, cried watching margarine commercials on TV. She was everything I wasn't, and perhaps that's exactly why we fell in love. She said I calmed her, that my silent presence made her feel safe. I said, well, I didn't say much, but I felt she completed me in a way I never imagined possible. We dated for 3 years. We lived together for 2, and during all that time, I believed that being physically present was enough, that working hard to build our material future was love, that sharing a bed, bills, and housework was intimacy. Marina tried. God knows she tried. She asked about my feelings, my fears, my dreams. She wanted me to share more of myself, to talk about my family, my childhood, about anything that would make me more real to her. But I always deflected. I'm fine. It was a normal day. Nothing much. These were my standard answers to everything. The worst part is that I truly believed I was being a good partner. I didn't yell, didn't fight, didn't cause problems. I paid the bills on time, helped with the cleaning, remembered important anniversaries. To me, that was love. To Marina, it was loneliness. The first time she mentioned feeling lonely even though I was there, I thought she was being dramatic. How can you feel lonely if I'm here? I asked. She looked at me with a sadness I had never seen before and said, Rafael, you're here, but you're not here. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. The arguments started becoming more frequent. She accused me of being closed off, of not caring about her, of treating her like a roommate instead of a girlfriend. I defended myself by saying I showed love in other ways, that I didn't need to talk about feelings all the time, that some people are more reserved, and that doesn't mean they love less. But the truth is, I was scared, afraid of opening that chest I had locked since childhood, afraid of discovering that inside there was nothing interesting, nothing worthy of sharing, afraid that if Marina really knew me, she would realize I wasn't special, that I was just an ordinary man, with an ordinary story, with ordinary feelings. The end came on a Sunday afternoon. Marina was baking a cake. She loved to cook on weekends, and called me to talk. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands covered in flour, and said, Rafael, I love you, but I can't keep loving a ghost. She had decided to move out, said she needed time to think, that maybe I should too. When you're ready to be a real person in a real relationship, call me, were her last words, before going to the bedroom to pack her bags. I sat in that kitchen, looking at the half-baked cake, smelling the sweet scent she had left in the air, and for the first time in a long time, I really felt something. I felt an emptiness so profound, it physically hurt. But even then, I didn't cry. I didn't yell, I didn't do anything. I just stayed there, in silence, as always. Marina moved out the following week. She took her plants, her books, her colorful paintings that I always thought were excessive. The apartment became cleaner, more organized, more dead. It was exactly how I liked things to be. And I hated myself for it. The months that followed were strange. I maintained my normal routine, work, gym, some outings with colleagues, but there was a constant feeling that something was wrong, like when you feel you've forgotten something important, but can't remember what. I tried not to think about Marina, not to stalk her on social media, not to go near the places we used to frequent together. I tried to move on, as I always had with everything in my life. But she was right. I was a ghost, and ghosts don't feel, don't love, don't live, they just exist. That's when the nightmares started. I'd dream I was in a white room, screaming for someone, anyone, but no sound would come out of my mouth. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I was suffocating. During the day, at work, I'd catch myself staring into space, lost in thoughts that led nowhere. My colleagues started to notice something was different. Peter, my business partner, asked me several times if everything was all right. And I, as always, replied that yes, I was just tired. But Peter has known me for over 10 years. He knew that answer wasn't enough. He was the one who suggested I seek help. Raphael, you've always been quiet, but now you seem faded. Like you're here, but you're not. It reminds me of how you were, when your father, he didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. When my father died, 3 years earlier, I had reacted the same way, total silence. As if nothing had happened. The idea of therapy terrified me. What kind of person needs to pay someone to talk? But the alternative, continuing to live like a ghost, terrified me even more. So after weeks of hesitation, I scheduled an appointment with a psychologist Peter had recommended. Dr. Carla Miller had a small cozy office, filled with plants and books. She must have been around 50, graying hair pulled back in a bun, reading glasses hanging from a chain. She looked more like a kind grandmother than a doctor of psychology, which put me at ease. In the first session, she asked me why I was there. And I, for the first time in a long time, tried to be honest. I told her about Marina, about how she left me, about how I didn't really understand what had happened. I talked about my childhood, about my silent father, about how I learned that words were unnecessary. She listened without interruption, only making a few notes occasionally. When I finished, and it took almost the entire session, she was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Raphael, have you ever stopped to think about what you really feel about all this?" The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? You told me the facts, the timeline, what other people said or did, but you didn't tell me what you felt at any point in this story. It's as if you were just an observer of your own life. I left that session feeling confused. There was something unsettling about her observation, something I didn't want to admit, but that rang true. I started paying attention to my thoughts, my feelings, and I realized she was right. I really was just an observer of my own life. The following sessions were difficult. Dr. Miller asked me questions I had never asked myself. How did you feel when your father died? What did you feel when Marina was crying? What kind of child were you before you learned to be silent? And I discovered with each question that I didn't know the answers. It was in one session, about 2 months after starting therapy, that she proposed an exercise that would change everything. Raphael, I want you to keep an emotional journal. You don't need to write about facts or events. Just about what you feel at each moment. It can be single words, phrases, drawings, anything that represents what's going on inside you. The idea seemed ridiculous. Me, a 41-year-old man, writing a diary like a teenager. But Dr. Carla insisted it would just be an experiment, something for me to try for a few weeks. I bought a simple notebook with a black cover, and I started. The first few days were frustrating. I would open the notebook, pick up the pen, and just sit there, blank, not knowing what to write. Today I feel normal. Today was a normal day. Everything seemed empty, meaningless. But gradually, something started to change. I began to notice small variations in my emotional state. Anger when the traffic was slow, sadness when I saw a couple kissing on the street, longing when I heard a song Marina used to like. They were subtle feelings, almost imperceptible, but they were there, and the more I wrote, the more I could identify them. It was like I was learning a language I had forgotten in childhood, the language of my own feelings. That's when the event I mentioned at the beginning of this story happened. Some say they are just coincidences of life, but I believe there are moments when the universe conspires to teach us something important. And that rainy Thursday afternoon was one of those moments. I was leaving a complicated meeting downtown. A client had rejected a project I had worked on for months, claiming that the design lacked soul. The word echoed in my head as I walked the busy streets. Soul, the same word Marina had used several times when trying to explain what she felt was missing from our relationship. The sky was overcast, typical of March afternoons in New York City. I should have taken a taxi or called an Uber, but I felt like walking. I needed to process that rejection, understand why it had affected me so much. Usually, professional problems didn't bother me. I always found a practical solution, adjusted what was needed, and moved on. But this time was different. The rain started slowly, just a few scattered drops. Then it gradually increased until it became a torrential downpour. People ran for cover, but I kept walking, letting the water soak me completely. There was something cathartic about the situation, as if the rain was washing away not only my clothes but also something inside me. That's when I came across a small park, one of those tucked away in the middle of New York City, like little green oases, amidst the concrete jungle. There was a bench under a large tree, and even with the rain, something drew me to that spot. I sat down, completely drenched, and for the first time in a long time I allowed myself to feel. I felt anger at the client who had rejected my work. I felt frustration at not being able to express what he called soul through my designs. I felt a deep, aching longing for Marina, a longing I had tried to suppress for months. I felt sadness for my silent childhood, for the distant relationship with my father, for the way I had learned to hide from the world. And it was at that moment, with all these emotions exploding inside me like a bursting dam, that I started to cry. It wasn't a contained, discreet cry. It was a visceral, full-bodied cry, mixed with the rain that continued to fall. That's when she appeared. I've already described her physically, a girl of about 7, with brown, wet hair plastered to her face, clothes as soaked as mine. But there was something about her that caught my attention. Her eyes. They were the eyes of someone much older, someone who had already seen a lot in life. Eyes that understood. She approached slowly, without haste, as if not wanting to frighten a wounded animal. She stopped in front of me, and stood there, watching me for a few seconds. She didn't say anything, she just looked at me with a compassion I had never seen in anyone, not even in Marina. Then she pulled a crumpled napkin from her pocket, one of those diner napkins, already somewhat wet from the rain, and offered it to me. The gesture was simple, commonplace, but there was a purity of humanity in it that left me speechless. She didn't ask why I was crying, didn't try to console me with cliches, didn't show discomfort with my vulnerability. She simply offered that little piece of wet paper as if offering a hug. I took the napkin with trembling hands, and tried to wipe my face, even knowing it was useless with all that rain. She remained there, standing in front of me, like a small wet angel, and then she smiled. It wasn't a smile of pity or embarrassment. It was a smile of recognition, as if saying, "I know how it is. I understand. Thank you." I managed to whisper, my voice choked. She nodded, still smiling, and said only, "Sometimes you just need to cry in the rain." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing among the trees of the park, as if she had never existed. I stayed there, holding that wet napkin, feeling that something fundamental had happened, but unable to understand exactly what. Perhaps you, who are following this story, are thinking that it was just a chance encounter, a beautiful coincidence. And it may well be, but if you've ever gone through moments of profound transformation in your life, you know that sometimes we need small signs, simple gestures, to understand great truths. If this story is touching you in some way, subscribe to the channel to continue following stories like this, because sometimes it's in the stories of other people that we find the answers to our own questions. When I got home that night, still thinking about my encounter with the girl, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called Marina, not to try to win her back. I knew I wasn't ready for that yet. I just called to say that I was trying to change, that I had understood some things she had tried to explain to me, that I missed her. She was surprised by the call, but we talked for almost an hour. It wasn't a reconciliation conversation, it was a conversation of honesty. I told her about therapy, about how I was discovering that I had spent my whole life running away from my own feelings. She told me she had started dating someone else, but that she was happy to know that I was trying to open up more. "Marina," I said at the end of the conversation, "you were right about me being a ghost. I really wasn't present, and you deserved so much more than that." "Raphael," she replied in the sweet voice I knew so well, "you don't have to be perfect to be loved. You just need to be true." After I hung up, I sat on the sofa in the empty apartment and opened my emotional journal, and for the first time, the words flowed naturally. Today I cried in the rain, and a child reminded me that it's human to feel. Today I talked to Marina, and I felt closer to her than when we lived together. Today I understood that spending your whole life trying not to feel is the most painful way to live. From that day on, something changed definitively in me. The sessions with Dr. Carla became more productive. I began to identify and name my feelings more easily. I began to allow myself to be vulnerable, first with her, then with Peter, then with some closer friends. I discovered that my childhood hadn't been empty as I thought. There were beautiful moments, there was love, just expressed differently. My father may not have been expressive with words, but he showed affection in other ways. He would get up early to make my school lunch. He never missed a parent-teacher meeting. He taught me to ride a bicycle with infinite patience, even after a tiring day at work. I realized that I had inherited his silent language, but that didn't mean there wasn't love. It just meant that I had never learned other ways to love, and that it's never too late to learn. I started being more present at work, too. Instead of just solving technical problems, I started really listening to what clients wanted, not just what they said but what they felt. My projects changed. They became more human, more welcoming. Peter noticed the difference, and said he'd finally found the soul that had been missing from my work. 6 months after the incident in the park, I returned to that spot. It wasn't planned. I was just passing by on my way to another appointment, but when I saw the bench under the tree, I felt like sitting for a few minutes. It was a sunny afternoon, completely different from that rainy day. The park was full of life, children playing, couples strolling, elderly people playing checkers, and that's when I saw her again. The same girl, now wearing a yellow dress and white sneakers, playing hopscotch with other children. My heart raced. Could it really be her? For all these months, I'd wondered if that encounter had actually happened, or if it had been a product of my confused mind at that moment of crisis. I got up from the bench and walked over to where she was. When she saw me approaching, she stopped playing and looked at me with those same deep eyes as before. She smiled, as if she knew exactly who I was and why I was there. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi," I replied. Do you remember me?" She nodded. You were sad that day. Now you seem better. Her simplicity disarmed me. How could a 7-year-old have such insight? I am, I replied. Much better. And thank you so much for the napkin that day. She laughed, a crystalline and joyful laugh. You're welcome. Sometimes people need a napkin, sometimes they need a hug, sometimes they just need someone to be there. The other children called her back to the game, and she waved to me before running to join them. But before she left, she said, keep crying when you need to. It's okay. I stayed there for a few minutes, watching her play, trying to process this second encounter. There was something about that girl that transcended her age, something that made me believe that our encounters weren't coincidences. Maybe it was my mind creating meanings where there were none, but to me, she had been an angel. A little angel with a wet napkin, who taught me that feeling pain isn't weakness, it's humanity. Today, 2 years after that rainy day in the park, my life is completely different. Not because everything magically worked out, but because I became a different person. A person who feels, who cries, who laughs, who allows himself to be vulnerable. I continued therapy for over a year. Miller helped me understand that the silence of my childhood hadn't necessarily been negative, but that I needed to learn other ways to communicate. I learned that vulnerability isn't synonymous with weakness, that crying doesn't make me less of a man, that expressing feelings isn't drama. It's life. Marina and I met a few times after that phone call. She was happy in her new relationship, and I was genuinely happy for her. We apologized to each other, me for being distant, her for not having the patience to help me discover myself. Today we're friends, not close friends, but people who respect each other and wish each other well. I met other people too. Women who didn't need to guess what I was feeling because I could express it. Relationships that didn't work out for other reasons, but that were real, true, connected. I learned that intimacy isn't just sharing a bed or bills, it's sharing fears, dreams, insecurities, the small joys of everyday life. At work, I became a better professional too. Not just technically, but humanly. My clients started seeking me out, not only for the quality of the projects, but for the ability to truly understand what they wanted. Peter and I expanded the office, hired more architects, and our specialty became creating spaces that people call welcoming, spaces with soul. But the biggest change was in my relationship with my own silence. I understood that I don't need to talk all the time to be present, but when silence is necessary, to comfort someone who is suffering, to really listen to what the other person is saying, to simply be together, it has meaning. And when words are necessary, to express love, to apologize, to share a feeling, I find them. I still keep the emotional journal. I don't write every day like I did at the beginning, but whenever I feel the need to process something deeper, rereading the pages from the first few months, I'm impressed by the journey. From those empty sentences like today was a normal day, to rich detailed accounts of small joys, passing sadness, specific fears, deep gratitude. I've returned to that park several times over these 2 years. Sometimes the girl is there playing, sometimes she isn't. When she is, she always greets me with a smile, like an old friend. When she isn't, I sit on the bench under the tree and reflect on how a wet napkin can change a life. Today, I know that that child, whoever she really is, angel, or just an exceptionally wise girl, taught me the most important lesson of my life, that it's impossible to truly love, work with purpose, or live fully when we're disconnected from ourselves. That feelings aren't inconveniences to be avoided, but vital signs that we're alive. That crying in the rain, sometimes, is exactly what we need to do. If you've made it this far in this story, maybe it's because something in it resonates with your own experience. Maybe you too are someone who has learned to live in silence, or maybe you know someone like that. What I've learned is that it's never too late to discover your own emotional voice. It's never too late to learn to feel, to express, to connect. I'm not saying I became a completely different person overnight. I'm still a more reserved person. I still prefer small groups to crowds. I still need moments of silence to process things, but now my silence is a conscious choice, not an unconscious prison. And I learned that sometimes angels appear in the form of children with wet napkins, at the moments when we most need to be reminded of our own humanity. I learned that life has a mysterious way of putting us exactly where we need to be, with exactly the people we need to meet, at the moments when we're ready to learn. Today, when I see someone sitting alone in the rain, I stop. Not always, not intrusively, but when I feel it's appropriate. Sometimes I offer a napkin, sometimes just a smile, sometimes I just stand there for a few seconds, so that the person knows they're not invisible, that someone saw them, because that's what that little girl did for me that day. She saw me. She saw me crying, she saw me suffering, she saw me lost, and she didn't walk past. She stopped, she cared, she connected. And in that brief but genuine connection, she reminded me that I wasn't a ghost, I was a human being who had simply forgotten how to be human. Today, I know that I am real, that my feelings are valid, that my voice matters, and that I never want to live like a ghost in my own life again. Life is too short and too precious to be lived at a distance from ourselves, and sometimes all we need is a wise child with a wet napkin to remind us of that.